Okay, we're good to go. Thank you for your patience, everyone.
Okay, Chief Ting, can you maybe talk about overtime a little bit, and then Holly, you can chime in.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about overtime. If we're talking about within the past year or so, we have had a dramatic decrease in staffing, where at one point we had 38 officers in total, where we were slated for 46 officers. And at the peak in my career, I think we've seen 52 officers at one point. So we have been at our lowest point as far as I can remember throughout my career. So 38 officers, if you take a look at that breakdown, 13 of the officers are in a supervisory position. We have 5 patrolmen that are assigned to the Detective Bureau. One's a neighborhood liaison officer and one is an administrative officer. So that leaves us with, forgive me on my math, I think 17 officers to handle every single shift, in which we have a minimum mandatory on every shift of 3 officers and 1 supervisor and 1 officer in house. And so that's contractual. So we have to maintain those levels for our minimums. And therefore, because we only have so many officers to go around in terms of filling those shifts, our overtime has been extremely high in the past year or so, to the point where we have supervisors that are now covering some of our patrol shifts, which is really rare. In the past, that used to be, a once in a while type of occurrence. But now we're starting to see that it's a lot more prevalent until we have our numbers up, and our numbers are increasing. We currently have 3 officers that are on field training. We have 2 officers that are going into the academy, and we are replenishing our numbers, so that number should decrease in terms of overtime for coverage purposes. Relative to other types of overtime, I think the question here was a discussion about what type of overtime, and that really depends. I think the question was, can we quantify and track the time and cost of police hours for noise on campus and on-campus events? Relative to overtime, when we assign overtime to officers, it isn't specific to just handling quality of life issues. We ask officers to respond to any call, so we do not quantify that. Certainly we can do that down the line if that's something that's being requested, but at this point in time, we don't do that. So overtime is, this year it's a lot. It's
Okay.
exceeding, so. Hopefully that kind of answers that. Any other follow-up questions relative to that?
Holly, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly talk about a couple of things. So one of the question was the proposed increase is 6.6% in the FY25 budget. What I wanted to do was just explain that a little bit. So what happened is in FY24, when the budget was put together, the police unions were operating without a contract. So last fiscal year's increase was not worked into their budget. So although this appears like it's a really large increase compared to some of the other departments, this is basically also making up for the fact that last year their contract was not settled. So we had to increase it by the amount of last year's contract and then also increase it for the FY25 contract. So it does have a bit of a snowball effect when the budgets are set with contracts not being in place. When the contract is not in place, that additional estimated cost of their COLAs goes into a holding pot. It goes just into the employee benefits line, waiting to see what their contract gets settled at and what that percentage will be before it is allocated out to their specific department. So this, I mean, it is a large increase, but it is also the sort of the net effect of 2 years worth of increases because last year's COLA was not worked into the budget figures. So that's why you see that as being a little bit higher this year. And then there was, I think the question was was there also a question of how much is overtime in this budget? I thought I read that somewhere. So the overtime budget for the police department is set at about $293,000. That has increased very, very little over the years. I just went back and looked in like a 10-year history, and that's only gone up about $30,000 in 10 years on their overtime budget.
Okay, thank you. Bernie, you had a question?
Yeah, just to Chief Ting, welcome to the welcome to the wide world of budgetary questioning.
I appreciate it.
I always looked at just to start. I've always looked at staff police overtime as sort of like an exercise, like reading the tea leaves. One bad case can throw one serious case can throw your overtime way off, and it seems like we've been able to avoid real ups and downs. So if I'm understanding you correctly, a good part of the overtime budget right now is due to open positions that are being filled and not demand, not extra need for extra police office hours. Is that fair?
Very much so. I mean, the thing is, so we've lost a few, our turnover rate has been extreme in the past few years in comparison to a decade ago, and that's for a multitude of reasons. Most recently, we've lost a ton of officers to the state police. So as I think everybody here knows, recruitment and retention is a major issue in policing across the country. So right now, there is really a lack of people who want to become police officers. So that pool is really small. So across Western Mass, all of our agencies in Western Mass are fighting from that same pool to try and get recruits in. So part of it is timing. It takes a solid year, at least for us to get an officer on the road. It's expensive. We did a case study in terms of how much it costs to get a recruit onto the road, and it's approximately $25,000 per recruit just to get them outfitted, trained properly, and to get them out on the road. So it's a huge expense, and especially when the state police comes around and they put out an exam, we usually lose a number of officers. So most recently, we lost 4 in the past couple of months directly to the state police. So we have to replenish that, and it takes us a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort.
Okay. And the other question I had relative to overtime is part-time. How do you see part-time is impacting the department? How do you have what kind of relationship does the department have with the district attorney's office about pulling officers into court for lengthy periods of time?
So we have a very strong relationship with the DA's office, and actually our figures for court time has dropped dramatically. We're in an age of we're trying to de-escalate and find other means other than having to criminally either cite or arrest somebody. So our court time is dramatically decreased to the point where it's, that's where we have some savings within our budget is court time.
Super. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, your hand is still up. Did you?
Sorry.
Okay. Kathy, did you have a question or a comment earlier?
No, it got answered. Thank you.
Okay. Chief, maybe I'm just thinking it would probably be more efficient for you to just go through the questions and talk in general about, I mean, we can all read the responses to the questions, but more talk maybe a bit more generally. I mean, I can see some issues. I mean, I would like you to talk about the level of staffing at full staffing, whether that's sufficient for covering the town or whether you would prefer to have additional officers. Talk about working with Crest, because that's obviously an issue that people are very much interested in. Maybe you can just go through some of the other questions as they are listed here on the the document.
Sure. In terms of staffing, if you were asking me if I had a wish list in terms of how many officers I could get, certainly I would ask for as many as possible. I take a look at in terms of staffing issues, is it enough? Is it viable? I think our department, the culture, and in terms of how much we do, I think we do a lot more with very little that we have. If I had my wish, I would have at least 75 officers. I think we could do a tremendous amount with 75 officers, or even, to be honest with you, if we got to the level of like 55, it'd be fantastic. There's a lot of outreach that I envision our department to be able to accomplish. I would love to have an outreach team. I would love to have a traffic unit to be able to respond to all the different complaints that we have across town. I think that's probably one of our largest areas of complaints, which is traffic and traffic responsibilities. So there's a lot of things that we would love to be able to do. We would love to have a community policing unit to be able to satisfy all of our goals. But of course, again, that's a wish list. And we would like to see an increase in that down the line, but we are always kind of playing catch up because of the turnover rate, based upon what we had talked about just a few minutes prior. And what was the second half of the question there, Bob?
It really had to do with working with Cress and
Yeah. So working with Cress, this also is a work in progress. As we all know, Camille just got on board. So we have some new leadership. There's also some new responders that are there that need to get up to speed. And, it's a work in progress. Something that I'm going to quote Timmy Nelson from saying is that we're building a plane while it's flying in the air. And that's truly the case at this point. So there's a lot of things to be ironed out. We have a very strong relationship with Cress. We've developed a nice partnership with Camille and the fire department, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that Cress is successful. I think that, as an agency, the Amherst Police Department has been there since the beginning in terms of supporting Cress. So we are open to ideas. I appreciate these questions that are being presented. But unfortunately, I don't have solid answers for all of the questions because, again, we have new leadership and we are trying to work this out to make sure that this works out as properly as possible.
thank you. Kathy, you just have a question?
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot on this interaction, but seeing elements of what has usually been in your table, including community policing, could some of that be done in partnership with a member of Cress? And I know we have right now a model that says police do one thing and Cress does another completely. But having seen what your community police person does, which is a lot of mediating and getting people to talk to each other around, so it's looking for, and this may be I'm looking for efficiencies where each group doesn't have to staff up for everything, because sometimes it feels like you both may respond. At a spring dance, the police show up and Cress shows up because each has been called, so it's that interaction and areas that's not by law required that only a police person does it. Is that clear? And I'm thinking forward to think of efficiencies, like we're not going to, yeah.
I'm sorry, to be honest with you, Kathy, I mean, we could probably spend hours on talking about that subject alone. And we are certainly open to different ideas to try and figure out what is the most efficient processes to make sure that we all operate productively and function correctly. So I know that the Cress department is currently working on standardizing their policies and procedures, and that really is kind of the structure that needs to be developed. So then we can kind of play off of each other and figure out, what calls are they going to, what calls are we going to. The example that you talked about, the spring dance, I believe there was a domestic situation that was involved. So really, anything with a crime element at this point is something that we are going to respond to. And anything with a level of safety element where somebody could potentially get hurt is something that we are going to respond to. But there are different models out there that we've seen from other cities that either have co-response or a program similar like CREST where it's tiered, where depending on the call, you might get a CREST member and a police member to respond. And then once you discover what's detailing that particular call, you can call one or the other off of it. So these are all different options that we're taking a look at and exploring to try and figure out what works best for the town of Amherst.
Okay, and I see Andy's hand, Bob, I think it is a longer discussion, so it's one. I just want to include be sure we ask it as a question in our report. Yeah.
Sure.
Andy?
Yeah, hi, Chief. When I'm reflecting back on last year's meeting, that was same meeting, just different grouping and different time, and with Chief Livingstone. And when we were talking about the chart that's, I think, on page 120, that shows the number of personnel in the department, I think that as I understood his response at the time was that he said that a number of employees shown in the organizational chart was what he considered to be the number that was absolutely necessary in order to be able to assure on a 24/7 basis that there are enough officers available to respond to any crisis situation in town where there was a potential of a safety risk for either responding officers or for the public at large. And so I guess what I just wanted to make sure that I understood his response correctly, and that it's, if so, that you feel that it's a correct response.
I don't know if you specified a number, Andy, or not. I don't recall that. So I'll be honest with you, I don't really recall what his response was in terms of what he felt was safe enough for our police department to police this community. Certainly I think at this current level right now, it is not safe entirely. We are struggling in many junctures. Like I said earlier, we have supervisors that are taking up patrol shifts, and that's a very unusual circumstance. And when you talk about burnout and the amount of time that our officers are expending, it certainly will affect their performance to a degree. We're a professional agency and we are trained extremely professionally. However, we're talking about the human element that takes a toll on our officers and our personnel. Certainly morale gets affected. So these are all things in their personal well-being. So these are things that we take into consideration to be able to produce the best customer service and product that we can produce for the public. So these are all things that are taken into consideration.
Yeah, of course, you had previously said, and I think about particular challenges that you are confronting right now because of turnover, because of that have required you to use overtime for just meeting routine shift requirements. So I guess the question I was really trying to get at is, assuming that all of the positions could be filled and we were back in the turnover question was taken care of by new hires who had met the training requirements, is the number that is shown the number that would provide at that point, the adequate coverage? Because we can't, unfortunately, we do have to deal with the turnover. And I guess that then I would have a follow-up question to after you've responded.
So, we are at 46, will be 100%. I guess your question is that adequate? I personally I think if we had 50 or more, would be adequate at the very least. So if we even at 46, we are still struggling in many areas.
And with that 50, and hopefully this will be my last question, would that increase also then provide a buffer so that when there's turnover, there's staff available to more completely fill in at the time that we are dealing with the turnover issues?
I think it would. If we had 50 officers and then if we lost a few here and there, we'd still have enough to maintain our minimum mandatory shifts. And the amount of overtime would certainly decrease. So I think it would be very beneficial. And at the patrolman level who are coming in, their base pay is pretty low. So it certainly is cost effective.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions. The next couple of questions are about really the dispatch, the communication center. One is that we had some increases in budget. Presumably it's because of what Holly explained. There was a drop in radio transmissions, and the response was that we're at it seems like we're at a minimum mandatory staffing level standard for the communication center. Is that correct?
So we have Jason Rushford on here, and he's representing our communication center. Jay, you want to chime in on this one?
And Bob, just a quick time check. We're at 2:35 right now.
Okay.
Hey. Hi, Bob. Yeah, we're staffed at fully right now at 12 positions. That's including Mike Curtin as the supervisor and 2 lead dispatchers underneath him, and then 9 dispatchers to work the line. We are fully staffed at that right now. We have a minimum of 2 dispatchers on per shift. We try to do 3 whenever possible, and at some points there's a mandatory of 3 on duty minimum for busy weekends, busy times. Ideal staffing would be 3 on duty 24/7. It would make our jobs a lot easier, a lot better for the residents calling in, a lot more continuity of calls, a whole host of things we could get into. We can work with 2, but that is our absolute minimum. 3 would definitely be ideal.
Thank you. Chief, there's a couple of questions we have about, one is about the clinical support operations and clinical co-response. Can you talk a little bit about that? Just explain kind of how that's what is it and how is it working? It seems to be new this year.
Sure. I invited Captain Young to join us because he is the head of our crisis intervention team, and he's a lot more well versed on this. So this is not something new. But Captain Young, if you don't mind joining in.
Good afternoon, everyone. No, it's not new this year. We've had a clinician assigned to the agency for a number of years now. Kind of the genesis of it began almost 20 years ago when we adopted the jail diversion project and the CIT project. It would have been, that might have been quite 20 years. I could double check that, 15, 16 years ago. And one of the essences of jail diversion, as the chief intimated earlier, was that we try to deal with core problems and make referrals as opposed to taking criminal action and some of the low-lying criminal responses that we have. In about 2017 or 2018, I met with the Department of Mental Health and went to a couple of different larger agencies that were employing co-response and saw what they were doing there. And the idea behind it is that police officers go and respond to the scene in concert with a trained, licensed clinical worker. once the scene has been maintained, in other words, safety is no longer an issue, the clinician and the police officer have a discussion about what's best for the client at that point. In many instances, the person can be de-escalated at the scene, and then it all becomes resource driven. Quite frequently, we go with our clinician, the police officers make conversation or have conversation with that clinician. She has a wealth of experience at CSO prior to coming here. And, we stay for safety reasons. There are other times when she feels comfortable to remain behind without a police officer. In many instances, she meets with them at the ED. There are so many different avenues that we can do to provide services to people that have some type of need, short of arresting them and bringing them before the court, where they can be ordered to some of the same services that they could get in real time. And that's the real basis of having a call responder, is that they're actually provided with services in real time and not after there's an arrest made or citations made, or in many instances, police officers didn't have the capabilities to de-escalate at the scene. So we would section 12 them and bring them to the hospital. And this is a way to do that without having to be quite as invasive. So co-response is not new. Almost every agency here in Western Mass employs co-response to some degree. Hadley PD does, Northampton PD, East Hampton, Springfield West Side. I mean, I was meeting with Hoyle PD back in 17 and 18, and they already had co-responders responding with their cops at that time. So that's in a nutshell. I could talk forever, and I know you guys are on a time constraint about it. It's done so many wonderful things for our community. It's limited our arrests. You see our arrest numbers have depreciated. We've changed the way one of the questions later on is why does our record keeping work differently, where there's more assist citizens? And what I did over the last couple of years is I went, the original call that would have been something like a disturbance or a shoplifting one, we've recoded those. Because we have put less value on the need for criminal response and more need for the welfare of the patient or the client. And that's why the numbers haven't really changed. I just kind of mumbly pegged some of it so that I could bean count at a later time to see exactly how effective this was. Bear in mind, the clinician doesn't work for us, right? So they work for CSO. So I have to have discussions with the supervisors at CSO about their effectiveness. And there's so many privacy concerns there, obviously. So sometimes we have to talk a little bit in code to make certain that the client's privacy is respected.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. My wife is a clinical psychologist, so I do understand the issue of privacy very much.
It's a very real thing, and we would never, because not only do we put the client in a bind, we put the clinician in a bind too. So
yeah. There's a number of other questions here, but maybe in the interest of time, maybe we could just focus on a couple. One is there was a question about the police cruisers and the costs of replacing them. And I know that we're trying to find hybrid cruisers to replace the gasoline cruisers. And the question is, what experience do we have? Do we have any sense of whether the hybrid cruisers will last longer, so we won't need to replace them as often? Will we get any savings other than the gas mileage, or is it just really gas mileage that we're gonna see lower costs for?
Well, that's hard to determine, only because the hybrid technology is still relatively new. When I say it's new, it's been out there for consumer products, but for police packages, it's not as new. So we face a lot of challenges. Ultimately, we would like to see all of our vehicles to be electric, but certainly that technology is not caught up yet for police vehicles. So right now we are a little bit hindered by only using hybrid technology. And so far, we use Ford products, and we use Ford products simply because that's the number one company that supplies for the police demand for services and for the product itself. So far, we haven't quantified it. Certainly we've seen cost savings in fuel usage, but in terms of How long they last, that kind of remains to be seen. Unfortunately, we don't have a large enough sample to be able to give you a valid answer to that.
Sure.
But so far, they've been pretty good. They've been holding up very well.
Chief, if I could just chime in there too, that the primary reason why we use Ford as well is because of all the gear that we put in there. It would be such an enormous cost if we had to retrofit. So long before Chief Ting was in charge, the decision was made that that was the product we were going to go with. So we're it's kind of like the guy who has one suit and buys new ties. We're kind of in the same boat right there. The retrofit cost would be enormous if we went to Chevrolet or some other source.
Yeah. Just you know, an aside, but my wife and I used to live in Northern Virginia, and there was a small town there called Falls Church. And there was a guy, you know it? Okay, so there was a guy there who now happens to be their member of Congress, but he at the time was just a business owner, and he owned a Volvo dealership. So when we went to Falls Church, we noticed all the police cruisers were Volvos.
Holy smokes! Holy smokes!
He said, "This must be a very wealthy town," but it turns out we donated all of them to the town. So
Neat.
Yeah, my hometown, they were all Chevys. But I'm happy that the whole retrofit piece was mentioned, because that's part of that goes along with the cars, is moving all that stuff from one car to another. You can't just get buy one off the lot. And the other thing is that, well, we don't hopefully never have to use them in a high-speed chase. They have to be prepared to handle a high-speed chase. And so, you know, yes, 100,000 miles is not bad for my car, but for somebody who might have to chase someone and do it safely and carefully, 100,000 miles could be a losing proposition.
Be honest with you, Bernie, we're trying to decrease any type of chases.
Oh, Jesus. Oh,
Yes,
we
yes,
don't like the
understand.
chases. The liability is just too much. But to be honest with you, you know,
we all have to stop watching television, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
All right,
And, you
Bob,
know,
I want to make us aware of the time. It's 2:45 and we have another
I
department.
understand.
Okay.
I'm trying to wrap it up.
Thanks.
So, Chief, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, not at this time, but certainly, you know, if there's any other questions offline that anybody wants to ask, you know, I'm certainly available, as well as Captain Young, at any time.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, gentlemen. We're going to now move on to the DPW. Bernie, do you want to lead the charge on this?
Sure. Guilford and
Thank you.
were, you know, you're here somewhere. They're making their appearance. Okay, we're here.
And Amy's here.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for. I printed it out, 10 pages of response. So Guilford, if you want to talk about the overtime budget, you can go ahead and do that. At least in terms of responding to the finance committee. I'm going to ask you, in the interest of time, to kind of hit some of the highlights where you see strengths and weaknesses in the budget, where you want to, where you'd like the department to move to. But before we do that, I really want to move the discussion off the usual paving potholes and snow removal, and focus on what you led in terms of your response to questions of stormwater management and environmental issues, and where we stand in terms of those of climate change, and where the environmental needs and regulations are beginning to really push the department in certain directions.
Well, as I said in my response, I mean, we could do a whole presentation on just how the environmental rules and the environment is affecting the department right now. We've had meetings with other agencies, and people kind of are amazed at how much we're involved in the environment every day. I mean, we're doing something we're doing is affecting the environment or being affected by the environment every day. It's just amazing. From our potholes to just operating the water treatment plant and the wastewater plants. We could really talk a lot about that. We really do need to beef up our staffing in that area. We have 2 people who work on most of that right now, and we need to really change that and add some more people. Our environmental scientists, it was recommended that, well, I recommended in my budget that our environmental scientist position be augmented with a manager type position to oversee the environmental scientists and our lab technicians and our staff that's involving handling all our permits. Well, water, wastewater, they have a permit that we have to abide by DEP and EPA. The landfill has an EPA and an EPA and a DEP permit as well. The landfill actually has 3 permits going on right now. There's the landfill closure permit, there's the transfer station permit, and there's the permit for the flare, which is an air quality permit, which has to be taken care of all the time. So we have a lot going on. Highway has to deal with our conservation department and water quality issues on the highway side, so they're doing it as well. We don't do basically anything. I said that really poorly, and I apologize. Everything we do is touched by it, and everything we have to do has some type of interaction with some environmental group, not just our conservation commission, but our state and federal partners as well.
And the other piece that we sort of led with was the so-called NIPD's permit. The particular concern there is stormwater runoff, waste from the streets, and coming into compliance with the EPA's requirements.
So, I mean, the best thing I can tell you about that is read the answer to the question. That's from Beth Wilson, our environmental scientist. She is pretty much managing the program for us right now. We have specific tasks we have to do. They're laid out, and we have annual tasks. They're laid out in the answers. And she's very, very good at what she does, as well as everything else she's doing right now.
And the other thing that I'd like you to discuss a bit, and you'll get a ton of more specific questions, is the construction issues. The construction issues around finding a new home for the DPW, around water treatment, and around the sewage treatment plants, and the infrastructure that connects those particular buildings.
So the new DPW building is going very slowly. Probably just as since you're the counselors, one of the issues we keep running into is there's no carve out in our zoning for municipal purposes. You want to build a fire station, the fire station has to meet the same requirements as if you want to build a for-profit restaurant or diner or hotel. These services and these facilities we're building are for the people of this town, to serve the people of this town. There's no profit. I get no profit sharing. There's no profit whatsoever in this for us. So, I mean, we're not cutting corners or wanting to cut corners for mere profit and increasing our bottom line. We're really doing it to try to get something for the public that works within the budget they're demanding us to work in. So our zoning is totally against us in some cases. Lot coverage, wetland, what you can do in a wetland buffer, what you can't do in a wetland buffer. Those are things that are totally something we can have a say in, but we choose not to as a community. So we're having a hard time with that, with finding a DPW home. Our wastewater and water facilities, water is in much better shape than wastewater right now. We were waiting to receive our permits from EPA and DEP on our wastewater side just to see what they were going to require us to do. They actually what they could have done is made us do an awful lot of changes to our facility and changed our processes a great deal. But we kind of came out on the good side. Now we just need to upgrade our facilities and get ready for the next round of permits in 5, 10, 20 years. But we will have some upgrades coming to the wastewater plant here, which are going to be costly.
I just want to come in with a couple of facts on this. because I've been putting together a report on wastewater. So I've been looking at the numbers, and our wastewater treatment facility, it's 45 years old. And there's a lot of equipment there that is original. And it's in a harsh environment. And so we're kind of every day struggling to maintain that equipment. And our sewer system, of all of the sewer collection system, 67% of the pipes in the ground are more than 50 years old. So 2/3 of the pipes in the ground are more than 50 years old. Like, we're fighting a battle because we haven't been able to get the funding in the past. And now we're at that critical point, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, and wastewater treatment plant is also sort of like an ongoing chemistry experiment.
It is. It's a
You never-
living creature.
Yeah, you got to keep the bugs happy.
Yes, the bugs
See-
aren't happy. The process
So-
stops.
We have had a couple of sort of overflows, fatbergs and the like in the last year or so that's just you're seeing you're saying more of that is likely to occur, or other again, how's that being managed?
So for our overflows, one of our biggest overflow areas is one of our pump stations. The pump station is pumping, and the flow into the pump station is greater than what's being pumped out, and then it'll overflow at a couple of manholes farther down. The pump station doesn't stop, or it still does its job, but the release is farther down the system. We actually have that under contract for replacement, and we'll be replacing that this summer. So that one should get better. We do have a lot of I&I we need to address, and that's probably the bigger issue, is addressing I&I as the rainstorms become more intense and we have more frequent rainstorms and less snow, we'll actually see more I&I, and that'll cause us to have some more overflows as well. So that is something we are looking at. We have a contract out for some pipe lining, which is where you slip a reinforced plastic or fiberglass plastic sleeve inside the pipe, you harden it, and you make the pipe, you rejuvenate the pipe, and you stop the leaks coming in. So we are working on that as well.
For those watching at home, I&I is infiltration and inflow. Never quite. It's water's getting in. It shouldn't be there.
Right.
Again, this has an impact on the funding on our.
If we could actually have a drought, we might actually see some positive on the I&I, because instead of inflowing in, the water table will drop low enough that the water in the sewer system will flow out of the pipes, X-flow, and we would have some help. But I don't know if there's really a drought in our future right now to help us.
Okay, but the impact on the enterprise funds here in terms of water and sewer, it looks like should be expecting increases in those because of construction, because of inflation, because of what?
But all three of those things are causing us problems right now. We added $200,000 to the water and to the sewer accounts just in the general O&M to cover the cost of equipment. Equipment has skyrocketed in cost. Wait times have increased. So inflation is a big issue for us right now. And because the plant's older and we're replacing more things, we're being hit with those costs now. If we had done it 15 years ago, we'd be paying a cheaper cost, but we're not. We're paying the costs that we have now. So inflation is our biggest issue right now as far as costs are going.
All right. So once again, deferred maintenance means broken. Mandy, Joe, did you have your hand is up?
Yes, I did. A couple questions for some of the stuff that's gone over, but I think the first one is about rates and maintenance. Rates are on our agenda for, I believe, next week. So I'd like you to come prepared to talk about those rate increases and potential need for more rate increases as it relates to all of this maintenance that you've been talking about, as we discuss the water and sewer rates, and get towards making a recommendation on those for the next year and the year after and all. Because I think a lot of this conversation and what you're saying directly relates to what we've been charging and what we should be thinking about charging in the future. And since we're on limited time, I want to save all of that for that next meeting when it it's pertinent to this, but it's also pertinent to that. So I think we can put it off. In terms of the DPW headquarters and other things like that, I know a couple of years ago, I asked our manager and our assistant town manager about have they looked at proposing changes to zoning to make it easier to build a DPW, particularly some of those lot coverage lines for municipal services, because when you're looking at RO and RLD, you're every acre of coverage, you need like 10 acres of non-coverage, because it's so low on lot coverage. But I guess my question for you is that it's twofold. One that was asked that was not answered in the documents. It was just left there, which is a statement of implementing the next phase of DPW headquarters as recommended by the feasibility study. Does that mean in your mind that the department is unwilling to consider alternatives to the recommendation? Meaning, are you unwilling to consider multiple locations, different size, multiple stories, things, because the recommendation was an 80,000 square foot building on one floor. If you consider multiple stories, you've decreased your lot coverage and all. And so the next question is also, have you talked to our conservation and development department, our manager, our assistant manager about the potential need for zoning changes in order to make it easier to potentially find sites to build a DPW because of the dimensional standards? And if so, where are those conversations, or what were those responses, given your, what sounds like a little bit of frustration or, struggle with that issue?
A discussion on zoning and so forth, that those discussion has been had with the town manager and the assistant town manager. They're quite brief discussions. They, if they have taken the information, have worked on it, they have not passed it back to me. It's not showing up anywhere else. As far as looking at alternative to the layout we have looked at multiple stories. We have looked at multiple sites. You have advantages and disadvantages to both of those. The contractor consultant we have working with us right now is wrapping up their study, and then we will be taking that to conservation and planning to talk about how to make this work in that area. And it may not, it may work, it may not work. There are concerns. And then we can sit down and discuss, once we do that, we can sit down and discuss possible ways of getting around it. Some of them may mean some of the things that are going on may mean, yes, we actually do build 4 different buildings. So if you build 4 different buildings, you have 4 parking lots, 4 stormwater treatment systems, you have staff space for 4 different buildings, which means showers, locker rooms, all separate things. Yes, they'll be smaller, but there's going to be a minimum size and they have to meet those requirements. So as you spread us out, if we decide to be spread out, or if the town so decides it, you're going to have to put all the amenities that are supposed to be there. There's going to have to be exhaust, just like in a police and a fire station where you have the exhaust systems for every vehicle controlled and some type of positive ventilation system. There's going to be positive ventilation in every little building you build that has vehicles in it. Where if you build one building with one system, you have some type of you have the word just went in my head, not my head. Sorry. I love getting older. But you have some economy of scale there when you do a bigger building. When you go smaller buildings, there's going to be a size building, which doesn't matter how small it is. It's still this amount of money to put that exhaust system in it, whether it is twice that size or 3 times that size. Those are the things we're seriously looking at, and we have to look at. I personally don't see, I'm not really sure how we're going to do this. I personally don't see it anymore, how we're going to do it. So it's really getting to be a little frustrating. But we're looking at everything, and to keep hearing people say we're not looking at things and we're refusing to look at things is even more frustrating. And I'm sorry to say it that way, but that's just the way I want to say it.
Kathy, did you want to have a comment? Kathy, you're muted.
It's a comment that is going to be brief because I'm conscious of time. Mary Jo just opened up a big topic that can't be easily answered. And Guilford, part of what she was asking wasn't many buildings. It was one taller building and putting the equipment in a Quonset hut. So I'm not saying that you're not looking at options, but there is starting to be, we might need a team to be looking at this. So I think, Bob, it feels to me there's another discussion that needs to happen, and it can't happen in the contents of the budget. And it bounced out to many of our attention because it says working on, and we weren't sure we even had a place yet. So I really think that this it's a plea to the town manager to get an internal group. So my only other question, and I think you've answered it through this terrific document, is it looks like we don't have resources for repairing pipes, for doing some of the basic things we have to do. And I don't know how much we've quantified that. So Mandy Jo asked, as you look toward our sewer system and our pipes, if it's rate increases over several years, the more people can have an understanding that we've got these pipes are going to fall apart otherwise. And I haven't, you may have those internal reports. So it's actually just creating documents for us to be able to use to explain to people what the backlog is. And I also noticed that you said your salaries aren't necessarily competitive in the marketplace anymore, that we hire people, we train them, and then we lose them. So I think that is another, trying to get a sense of staffing, lack of staffing and key things because of turnover. And I don't, that's not in the document right now, but you spoke to it. So I don't feel like we need a lot more information right now, Bob. I just think we need to flag these as budget concerns. That I think that's my main comment. And I will say, just Paul, in a general comment about the budget book, I like the fact that the enterprise fund shows us what the fringe benefits costs are. When we look at other departments, we don't even see a multiply it by 25% or something that fringes. So we get a fuller sense of the staffing costs because you've got the larger piece. So I was glad to see that in those budgets. Thank you.
Just one quick thing. I mean, we are looking at multiple story buildings. We have broken the site down for the DPW, but what we're looking at is a site that's not going to serve for 20 years. It's a site that will work for the future. So even if we build a building which is 3 stories tall and all the admin functions are on the top 2 stories and shops are on the bottom, we still have to know where all the layout is for the equipment, and those layout areas, which may someday hopefully be built into buildings, because we've actually gone to the point where we're just going to have everything outside basically, except what has to definitely be inside. You still have to account for those future things. So if you took away that we're not even thinking about going up in the air and we're just trying to be spread out everywhere, we're really not. And I'm just going to say that. And if we want to have a committee, great, we can have a committee and work this out and push a little farther. Maybe we'll go a little faster.
Councilor Hanneke?
Thank you. No, and I know that's for discussion later. And I don't know whether, I don't think this is a Guilford Amy question, but it's an enterprise fund question that I sent in late and it didn't look like it made it to any of the documents, and it's about the transportation fund. That whoever needs to answer it in writing would be great, but I wanted to make sure I got it out. I noticed the transportation fund was using retained earnings to essentially cover what looked to me like 15% of its expenses. And so I have a question about whether that is sustainable, or what is the plan to reduce the use of, if it's not sustainable, to reduce the use of retained earnings to pay for the expenses from the transportation fund. And I just wanted to get it out there before I know we have to move on other things.
There is a memo on response on the transportation fund, which I have not had a chance to read, which we got just a very short time ago. So it's there.
And those questions, Jen LaFountain would probably be better, or maybe Holly can speak to those. Holly has her hand up.
Holly?
I can very quickly speak to the transportation one. And the reason why we had to use $136,000 worth of retained earnings in this year were for one-time purchases for capital. So we had $144,000 worth of capital requests in this year and not enough recurring revenue to cover those. So the retained earnings is for one-time purchases of capital. It is for a new vehicle. Was the big item that was needed, and some additional parking kiosks, painting, and repairs to the elevator in the parking garage.
Thank you. Anything else on DPW or enterprise funds? Okay, Councilor Haneke?
Sorry, just one more for potentially later. We've heard about the staffing situation and the potential need for staffing for stormwater, for, you know, other things. Maintenance of athletic fields. That question was there, but didn't have an answer to it. So if you could later on, or send us later thoughts on how the potential, or what, I guess I asked it as the level of maintenance is doable within the current budget versus what is being asked as potentially or talked about for later. If you could just expound on that somehow, about what the level that has been discussed potentially with the redo of track fields and all of that, what that would look like within your budget or your personnel as we move towards those conversations, potentially at later meetings regarding funding of track. It would be great to have.
But that was a late answer. I got Alan's note to give his piece to that, and then I added some more to it. So I sent that on later. But quickly, just the part I put on there so I can pass it on is, you know, when we were asked to do a plan to maintain the fields, we actually came in with three pieces. We had a capital piece that we needed, we had a personnel piece we needed, and we had an ongoing maintenance, which is ongoing materials. Capital piece was funded, the personnel piece was not, and the materials part was not funded. So that's where we're starting this year. The capital equipment is all in, but the request for additional personnel did not happen. And then the request for additional material did not come forward either. So we'll be scrounging around trying to make things work and adjust things for the next year. And hopefully in the next budget, we can probably get some more material at least in, so we have the material we need.
Mandy, this wasn't in a document. It was in the email that I sent you. If you scroll down, those responses are there.
Thanks.
Any other questions or any issues? Okay, why don't we we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Guilford and Amy, and we'll move on to the regional public schools.
Thank you. Goodbye.
So, Paul, did you want to say anything about the school budget?
Yeah, sure. So the you know, the regional school district had asked for an 8% increase, or a 6% increase, I'm sorry, and we had submitted a budget of 4%. And we have been, just so you're aware, we're looking at different funding options to achieve that gap, that additional 2% gap. You know, the only sources that we really have are one-time funding. So it's something that we'd want to, we're going to dig into a little bit more to figure out what that would look like in terms of in terms of increasing the base for the school district, which I think that the budget coordinating group later this week, we're going to look at some projections in terms of what does it mean to the town's overall finances if you increase and build into the base an increase of 6% versus 4%. And our goal is to have that presentation to the BCG so everybody, all the elected officials can see what that looks like. I do recognize that, you know, we have a brand new superintendent coming on board. They're going to have a, you know, there's a ramp up time. You have to give people time to get their feet wet, and presenting them with a very challenging budget situation right off the bat is probably not a great thing. And so that's why we're working pretty hard to figure out where that 2% would come from. We're looking at ARPA, quite frankly, as this primary source. The impact there, but there's every choice you make to support an operating budget means that there's a consequence. And so that consequence in this case would probably be in terms of the solar panels at the Fort River School, that we would reduce, and to be able to meet the operating budget needs of the district. So that's, I just want to sort of say, put it out there, like that's where we're thinking, and with the goal being that if we were to move that direction, you would see a revised budget request from the town manager to the council that the council would then act on, or would have an explanation for how we would reach that additional 2%.
Okay. Kathy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess, Paul, I had hoped we would hear a range of potential options for financing. As you know, I sent you some ideas. So my question is not, don't use ARPA, but if there are alternatives, will the council have an opportunity to weigh in? I'm totally in favor of going to the 6%. So I understand the issue is both how to fund it for FY25 and then worry about FY26 and where that money comes from. So going to BCG is one route to go, but I think ultimately we're going to have to figure out how to finance it at the council level. So when is that discussion going to happen? Because we are due to write a report, and I'm squirming here because my draft sections for the finance report to the council happen to be the regional school and the elementary school. So right now I have this, we recommend that, and a series of blanks. And I've got the $355,000 in a couple places, and here's where the money could come from, and then raise them. So it's a timing issue on getting more information. So one way I thought of drafting it is, here are potential financing sources, and those will be determined later. And I was going to just do bullet, 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 but I don't want to do that without being informed by what you and the finance, your teams are looking at. So that's a long way of saying I thought we would get more today than what you just gave us.
Yeah, so we don't have more today. I mean, again, we've been, Sandy Pooler's been away for a week, quite frankly, so that's part of it. But also, it's the council's role is to appropriate the funds, not to identify the funding sources. That's our responsibility. And so if we, you know, in the requirement is that the budget be balanced. If I can deliver you a balanced budget based on the guidelines from the council, then the council when it votes, really just, it does vote the appropriation level. And, you know, welcome your ideas. I mean, always, because you're always thinking about those things.
Bob, can I just follow up on, that is our role, but we're being asked to consider the capital fund and the capital plan.
Yes.
The capital plan has a 12-month debt service line item for the Jones Library. And as far as you can see, there won't be 12 months of it. So we're going to be asked to approve that as well. So when I say, we may not say, take it from here or take it from there, but some of these things are interactive with other decisions we're being asked to make. So that's where I think of the appropriation role, is looking interactively with other budgets. That's it.
Yeah, no, but I understand that. But again, the council's, you know, the capital budget has a goal of 10.5%. And so what you're suggesting is taking some of the one-time capital funds and putting it into an operating budget. And I think that's not where the guidelines have been.
I realize that would be, and they were guidelines set by the council. So I guess I don't feel like anything is in cement right now, but in any case, if it's cemented, you know, it just means it may warrant a discussion on whether it's, I understand that would mean capital wasn't 10.5, it was 10 point something. Yeah, I do understand that. Yeah.
Councilor Haneke?
I got a lot of questions, a lot of thoughts. And my questions I think are gonna apply to Paul, but then I'm gonna try and ask some for our school committee members and superintendent that are here too. So bear with me as I think through some of this. Paul, you just said if you're moving in the direction of funding it through something like ARPA, you would submit us a revised budget request. Meaning, does that mean you're trying to not have to make the council use the MGL that allows the council by a 2/3 vote to increase one budget area and decrease another area? So that's sort of question number one. Question number two, you just said that the council's role is to appropriate, not identify sources, but the council does have this option of using the MGL to increase one and essentially identify another line item in the budget to decrease. And so I think that's where Kathy's question is going, of hoping to hear other options, because we could decrease another line item that would include, it could be the elementary school line item, it could be the OPEB line item, it could be a capital line item, it could be the municipal government line item, it could be a combination of all three. I'm throwing a lot out there so that no one hates just me. You know, and sort of everyone can say, oh, I don't want to do that one. But you know, that 355 could come from a number of different ones. And I think this committee is hoping to hear your thoughts on each of those sort of potential options of, if the council were to use that one. I do appreciate you trying to find a way where we don't have to use that one, but you know, that option is always there. If we don't use that, if you submit another budget line, another logistical question, do we need another public hearing on the budget? How does that work under our charter? And is there enough time for that if another budget is actually submitted, or, you know, that, how does that process work? For the school committee members, one thing Paul just asked or put out there was using ARPA, including, or more particularly, the potential of not building more solar on the Fort River school site, which would have an effect of, if we had used ARPA for that, instead of potentially using it for 1 year of operating at the region, the elementary would, if ARPA was used for that solar, would incur and reap the benefit of lower operating costs for 20 or 30 years. What does the school committee think about losing that 20 or 30 year decreased operating cost at the elementary level in favor of 1 year of increased operating costs, expense, you know, funds at the region level? Another question is, the three towns that have voted this budget and this assessment method have all, my understanding is, they have all found the money through savings, through one-time non-recurring revenues. And it sounds like our executive branch is seeking to find the money also through one-time non-recurring revenues. What is the school committee's position on that not becoming the base then for the next year? Because as we all know, using non-recurring revenues as the base for operating fund increases has put us in this position of massive decreases. So what is the school committee's thought of keeping the base at the 4% level that was originally 4 towns agreed, but accepting the 6% level next year, but realizing that the base needs to begin at an increase from a 4% level, because that's what's built into each of the 4 towns' operating budgets, recurring revenue operating budgets instead of non-recurring revenue operating budgets. For now, I'm going to stop there. That's a lot.
Already? Okay, so I can address the ones that were started towards me. So the council has the ability to override the budget by 2/3 vote if it makes reductions. You have the authority to reduce any line item, you know, any item as well. So those authorities are with the council. That's your decision. You know, if we again, I'm putting out there that we're looking in this. We don't have confirmed a recommendation to you. All the different options are looked at. We would recommend against using reducing our OPEB funds. We recommended against a certain number of things because we think that's bad policy, and also we just went through a bond rating which we were successful in renewing our bond rating at AA+. Part of our major argument is that we continue to contribute in a responsible way to our OPEB obligations and to our pension obligations. I think dipping into that is damaging to us, especially when we're entering an era when we're going to be going out for bonding in a significant way. But again, you have the authority to override the budget request by a 2/3 vote for the school department if you so choose. You have the ability to reduce any, the budget as you see fit. Right now I put out that I would submit a revised budget. It may not be necessary to have a revised budget if we do fill that 2% with ARPA. May not have to be a separate process. If there is a revised budget, does it require a public forum? It's a good question. I don't, we've talked a little bit about that, but we haven't really dug into it in terms of exactly what the format would be. But there is time to address that. So I think that I tried to address the ones that I'd written down. And just sort of something you asked the school committee about is, it's not a good plan to be funding operating budgets with one-time money. It's a bad plan. But we recognize the situation that we're in. We recognize the constraints that the school district is in and the sort of challenging management, with a brand new superintendent coming in. So totally recognizing that and seeing that these are extenuating circumstances. But that's why I would be recommending that we look at bringing everyone to the table to really look at what is the long-term sustainable plan when by definition our revenues are constrained and by Proposition 2.5, and what is our plan as a community, because schools are very valued, as everyone knows. So I think that's an important piece of this conversation, that we continue to work at this together as both school committee, school officials, town council, town officials, things like that.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the discussion that we've been having. I look at this from my years of working on this as needing to be addressed as an FY25 issue, and that I therefore do not like the idea of getting into the discussion of the base, because I'm not sure that it has relevance to anything in the end when we get to dealing with FY26. I think we really need to address the question of, is this something that's necessary and appropriate to do for FY25, and how do we go about doing it, and if we do it? And I think that those are the things that I would like to focus on and let FY26 take care of itself when we get there. But I would very much be encouraging the school committee to not use its usual method. I think that that usual method of developing budgets has created a crisis that has exhausted us. And that is to take level services, figure out the cost of level services, and then make adjustments to a level services budget. I think it's time for the school committee and the school administration to think about a different methodology for beginning the budget discussion, because this has created a crisis year after year where we just have continued to handle budgets 1 year at a time and let our decisions be made on what programs to be cut on a year-by-year basis, as opposed to with a long-term vision of what we're going to do. And I realize that we're coming in with new superintendent, and I welcome a new superintendent bringing fresh ideas to it. I think we need to start a process, but we need to make sure that we involve our new superintendent into being a real voice in that process. The other things that I just wanted to bring up just really quickly is, I heard the presentation that was being made by Kathy regarding possible changes in the capital budget that result from decisions that might be made with the library. There are a lot of factors with the library. I think it really opens up such a huge topic and so many unknowns. And I only have to cite back to the discussion that was reported in the newspaper the other day about the cost of doing the repair option B, if the repair option B becomes necessary. We have no real information that is going to allow us to make appropriate decisions. I think we came to 10.5%, worked for years to get 10 to 10.5% on capital, because we realized that the town was not being served by not getting there, and that it would be short-sighted to use a one-time opportunity to take money away from that source when there are so many things that have to be done on capital, not the least of which is roads we drive on every day. And I guess the last thing that I wanted to just say is that this morning we had the monthly fiscal policy committee meeting of the MMA, and the issue that we are confronting here and that we have read about in so many districts in neighboring communities in Western Massachusetts is not a regional issue. It is a statewide issue, and there certainly, with Senator Comerford being one of the leaders, had efforts to try and think through long-term solutions, but long-term solutions don't get here in the short term. And we are going to have to be factoring that in as we go forward. So those were comments I wanted to make.
Thank you, Andy. Bridget, did you want to weigh in?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say a couple small things. Doug can give you the numbers, but I remember from the Four Towns meeting that he showed the difference between if we added the amount to the base or if we did not, and what that meant for the long-term sort of school budgets. And so I may need to talk to Mandy offline, but my feeling is that the other towns included it as part of the base. So so we would be the outlier there if we used it as a one-time fund. And then just in terms of like, we're here with our regional school committee hat, so we can't, put on the Amherst school committee hat and say whatever. So, but obviously I think in all the school buildings, and especially in my role at the region, but on the elementary too, the more sustainable we can use operating funds to increase the sustainability of those budgets, the better. So I don't like the idea of, using the solar panel money at all. And the very final thing I wanted to say is I think the Senate was going to vote even today. And so there might be a little bit more money there in the rural school aid and the 110 that Senator Comerford was looking for. So maybe someone has more updated information than me. I've been at work all day, but I know that was going to happen today. And there's just one final thing. I wonder what the timeline was of going up to 10.5% and how that aligns with the timeline of the schools getting less in the budgets. I haven't looked at it. It's just a question that popped into my head. So I think the very final thing I would say again is just if that big question of each department getting 4% is really an interesting question, because do we prioritize equality or do we prioritize equity? And I do think like every department has high needs, but the school needs right now are out of proportion to anything we've seen before in education.
Thank you. Kathy, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I want to just weigh in, Paul. I mean, this is more direct to you in terms of ARPA. As Mandy very quickly rattled off, the solar money not only potentially generates an offset to the utility costs in the school, we get a federal rebate on it once we spend that money. So it's not $1 million we're spending $1 million, but then we're getting another thing back. So it's a phenomenal investment. So you have two other batches of ARPA money, and we have to designate them by the end of the year. We don't have to use them by the end of the year. One is a youth center where we've never quite figured out what that money is, and one is a large chunk of for bangs. And so I just really urge you, I'm not against taking it out of ARPA, but just really to think on where is it coming from, and it's that piece. Then the other, this is directed at regional schools a little bit. We've got before us some choices on the track and field project. And when I looked at what I'll call option 2, the middle one, that gives us a restored field but doesn't rotate. If you took a piece out that could be funded later, mainly lighting, and plan to go back to all the towns for CPA money for lighting, you don't get 355,000, but you get pretty close. And if we thought of it that the town's piece was 900,000 of free cash, so if we do something less than that toward it with that as a new different source, it could then go into the regional budget. So I'm just putting, this is Kathy thinking over the weekend on where could the money come from, on here's a piece and here's a piece, and trying always to get to I don't get up to 355, but I get up to a big chunk, and then the ARPA money could supplement it. So just trying to think of ways of getting the most. And so I, with the solar, we have enough, just so everyone understands, we have enough for the Fort River School. It's in the Fort River School budget, enough to offset all of the energy costs. So we just went through that today again in the sustainability. This would be in addition, and we haven't quantified it yet, but I've always thought it could probably offset at least Crocker's electrical utility. And we can get, at some point, we can get a more accurate number. Is it Crocker and part of the school system? We don't, on how many panels are we buying for how many kilowatt hours, but thinking about it as offsetting costs. And we just went through a budget, Paul, where all over the place saying, this is a little bit lower because our solar fields helped with the enterprise funds. This is lower because our solar fields help with the electricity. I mean, that's a direction of a return that keeps giving, that's not one time. So I just really think we should be very careful. Even if I have no say about it, I will keep asking the questions about it in terms of making really wise choices in terms of return. And I think of an investment and a return mainly with solar, because it's not just you spend it and it's gone. It keeps giving back to you. So I'm finished there, but I just think there are choices. And so the more we're careful about them, the more we're not causing another problem or giving up on something that we really wanted to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Bernie?
Yeah, back when there was a discussion about artificial turf versus natural turf and the costs and all that, my sarcasm gene kicked in, and I made the suggestion that if we were going to play on natural grass, then we should probably play with natural light. And I was pleased to hear Kathy just suggest that you could take the lighting out and do it later. So there's a theme here, I guess. I'm always concerned about using one-time only money for any kind of ongoing operation. And I think it falls to Paul to do a upside, downside assessment of each choice that he's considered for funding the $355,000, which I firmly believe should be a one-time only gift. I heard from several members of the school committees, regional school committee, that you know, we need this we need to fix this. We need to band-aid this because we'll fix it in a year. Well, I don't trust that it'll be fixed in a year because it's a difficult problem. And it's one that's going to have to be solved, I think, in the methodology that Andy described, where you're going to have to really go to like some kind of zero-based budgeting effort and kind of take things apart. And I do want people to not discount the prospect of a $15 million bill for fixing the library, maybe not all at once, but it's likely will be there. And I don't want people to discount our bond rating. We haven't bonded for the elementary school yet. We haven't bonded for the fire department. We haven't bonded for the DPW facility. We do some mini bonds every year to pay for capital. That, to jeopardize that rating is analogous to the solar thing. I mean, if you knock the solar out, you're going to lose electricity savings going forward. If we jeopardize our bond rating, we're going to pay in interest costs going forward for the next 3 decades. Thanks.
Thanks, Bernie. Anyone else? Councilor Haneke?
Yeah, I want to follow up and hear from the acting superintendent or interim superintendent and our school committee members. In some sense, I agree with Andy of no matter what we do this year, next year, the school committee needs to do in some sense, needs to present their budget differently because it is the way it's presented is much different from the way the towns present their budget. Paul gets a number of what the town can afford, and he fits his budget into that number. The schools, on the other hand, decide what they want and then say, oh, but if the town can only afford this, here's what we have to cut. It's at least that's how it appears from my chair as to how that budget is presented. And that creates a lot of tension that we don't see in the municipal budget. Although what did we just hear in the first hour of our municipal budget discussion? There's not enough staffing in our municipality departments to do what we might be needing to do, and we're having to make hard choices. But what I'm hearing from the school committee is it would become part of the base, and the other towns just voted it as part of the base. Well, yes and no. And that's why I think we can't not talk about the base number, and that's where I disagree with Andy, because what we just heard from school committee members is it just became part of the base, and that's what level services will be starting from, and then we'll see these cuts. But when the other towns have voted to pay for that 2% out of their savings, which my understanding is they have, I don't understand how the school committee can say it's now part of the base when it's not part of their recurring revenue funding. And that's where we're looking at if Amherst funds this extra 2% and 355, a 2.5% increase from 4% takes us to that 355 plus a little bit more, because we can't just dump that 355 that we used, say, ARPA funds for into the next year's 2.5% increase, because it's not there in our operating budget this year, even if we fund it. That's where Bernie's comment of it needs to be a gift is. But if you take it as, well, if Amherst funds it at 6%, that's where Amherst's 2.5% increase starts next year. We don't have that anywhere in our operating budget to begin with to work it into the next year. And so I think some of us are struggling with not just how do we find it this year, and if we pay for out of one-time funds, we're struggling with what is the school committee going to come to us next year when they present a budget that has based their assessment and their level services on a number that isn't sustainable to begin with because it was paid for out of savings this year. And then when they say, oh, but we have to cut 20 or 30 positions, we can't do that. That's where, to me, that rubber hits the road of, is this really a request for one year? And I keep hearing, in some sense, different things from different people of how would we pay for it next year, which gives me pause of even using one-time funds this year to pay for it, because I feel like when the FY26 budget comes in, we're going to be told, well, we can't cut those positions, and well, you funded it last year, but if we fund it this year out of one-time funds, we haven't really funded it for more than 1 year. And so I don't see how we can then consider it part of, quote, level services going on, or what the, not necessarily level services, but part of what the town should be able to afford a 2.5% increase on in the next year. And so I really do want to hear more from the school committee and the superintendent on whether there's been conversations with the incoming superintendent on how to deal with this, what the plans are, even if they're just vague conversations at this point. What will we be facing in FY26 in terms of what does the school committee expect us to potentially increase from our payments each year? Are we looking at an increase from that 6% budget of is it expected to be 2.5% from that 6% if we pass it, or is it expected to be 2.5% from the 4% that the towns have built into their current operating budget versus the 6% that 2% of it's not built into recurring funds? I know it's not very clear, but that's where I'm struggling.
Andy, I know you have your hand up, but I'm going to give Doug the opportunity to respond.
Yeah, I'll just share a couple things. First and foremost, I think part of why we've presented our budget the way we have over the years is partly due to the fact that our employees work on a hard fiscal year, actually a hard school year basis. And so in our contracts, we have particular notice requirements based on that. Whereas with town staff, it's a little different. And that's not better or worse, it's just the nature of the beast. But we have notification requirements that we have of whether people have or don't have an employment with us. In our teaching contract in particular, we have to let people know, by the 15th of April about whether or not we think they have a position for the coming year. And so we tend to operate from that mode. So I think that's part of why we presented, from a level services kind of mindset, which is different than the town. If we did it more like the town, where it's like, all right, here's how much money, and we fit within that, we're still going to have a conversation about what are the reductions in staffing, because we're going to have to notify people about those reductions in staffing. And that's going to matter a lot to what does or doesn't happen, and what does that change with regard to what we offer as a program of studies and that sort of thing. So we kind of end in the same place. It's a little bit of semantics in some respects. The other thing I'll say is just I want to retune people's mindset a little bit about, talking about a base. And it's not to be disingenuous at all, because I think that we put in guardrails in our assessment method over the last few years, because we tend to have our assessments grow at a greater pace than our other revenues that come into our budget. So we have Chapter 70 and reasonable transportation and reimbursement for charter schools and Medicaid reimbursement. We have different sources of funds, and most of those have held pretty flat. But if for example, what I want to keep in mind is that even with the 5-year averaging that we do of minimum local contributions and enrollment, you can have pretty significant changes in your assessment based on just that alone. So you can have, when you start looking at the sort of your percentage of the bill, we take the total cost of what we think we're going to need to do next year, and we could do that from a zero-based budgeting standpoint or some other mechanism to sort of come up with a number. We're going to subtract out the other sources of funds like Chapter 70 and that. We're an amount to be assessed to the 4 towns. And our assessment method divvies that up a certain way. We've used a base of the previous year as a frame to limit that because that's the way most other budgets are derived. However, we could use something else, but also just note that even with 5-year averaging, we can still have notable swings in the sort of percentage piece that any given town owns in a particular year. So even with 5-year averaging, I've seen Pelham have a +3% or +4% in their piece from an independent of ultimate bound of total to be assessed, just as a percentage of the total to be owned by that community. And Amherst tends to have a lot smaller swings because we're much bigger. But nonetheless, we can still have significant changes by virtue of significant changes to EQV, other things the state does. So it's not as though the assessed amounts to each are as fixed as they seem. So it's not quite the same of sitting with a flat amount that we then build from. It's really an amount that we are estimating we need to be funded by the towns. We divvy that up based on our assessment methodology. And then we compare that to, what's happening year over year, because that's a frame of reference that's common to all 4 communities. But I think that, one of the reasons we don't do the pure statutory method is because the volatility from one year to the next is really kind of high, even higher, with a 5-year averaging method that we use for both students and for minimum local contributions. We can see swings of the 3% range for a given community. With the pure statutory method, it can be even more extreme than that. And you have communities, much smaller districts than ours, or 2-town districts. They will sometimes have a 10 or 12% increase from one year to the next from a pure statutory method. And even though the total budget itself may not go up that much. So we can have small increases in the amount to be assessed, and yet an individual town can take a huge hit depending on the assessment method. So I just want to have that be part of the context of the conversation, to understand that it's not purely from a base number and then plus X%. It's really an assessment method that divvies up an amount we're trying to parse amongst all 4 towns. I hope that's helpful as far as just explaining some of the context.
Thank you, Doug. Andy?
Yeah, I appreciate actually the order you put it in, because I guess I had one question that goes back to Doug again. And that is, I'm not sure that I understood where the timing of the budget process and the need for layoffs fits in with the development of the budget, because budgets are developed earlier in the year, and the presentation of the budget and the work of the 4 town meetings has developed in a much earlier pace, working towards town meetings. So the layoff notice date really doesn't seem to fit in with the process or the question of why it would be inappropriate at this point to really take a fundamental long-term look at the funding of our schools. And, I look across the river at our friends in Northampton and what they're going through right now. And Northampton has had a much better track record, I think, in some ways, and certainly East Hampton has, of thinking through a long-term plan for schools that they've been able to do because they're single communities supporting their school. But as a region, why is it so much more difficult for the region? The other thing is that Bridget earlier had said, well, gee, we're about to enter the conference committee process and the legislature, and there's hope that we're going to see some increases that'll come from more regional school fund, small school funding. So, and of course, we're looking at what's going to happen in the dollar level for Chapter 70. Those revenues for the region go to the region; they don't go to the towns. And so, we certainly aren't turning around and saying, "Hey, give some of the money back to us." But it isn't helping us, other than what we're going to get from increased Chapter 70 that will allow us to do to have a little bit more flexibility when we talk about the elementary school and the budget in general. And we have generally not separated out the funding that comes from Chapter 70 from other funding, because in the end, the town gives so much more to education than we're required to by the state. We're so much above the minimum requirement that it is an irrelevant number. So I think that we really have to cheer on the process in Boston that'll happen, do our best to provide comments, but not think that it is in any way linked to a difficult decision that we have to make.
Doug, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just quick additional thing I would talk about with regard to the sort of notification. So, when we met as 4 towns in February, and we did that before the sort of public hearing process for the regional budget. While we didn't have specifics of what would be cut, we did have and tried to have as accurately as we could some estimate of the FTE reduction that we'd need to do to be at that 4%, which is where we had conversations when we met in December. So I think in other years we've had the hard conversations about what's at risk in those sort of January and February 4 towns meeting. I think that while we weren't specific, the writing was on the wall with regard to the FTEs that were at risk. When you start talking about 5, 6, 7 FTE, and this is on all of us for not sort of recognizing the sort of impact. It's going to be programming that people care about deeply. And so I think that it behooves all of us, and when we're meeting in even December, we had rough estimates then, but they were much rougher and fortunately got smaller over time. But we need to be aware of that sort of order of magnitude without the specifics, because I think it does dictate to us the sort of kinds of changes that are at risk in those. But that's not to disagree with Andy's point about the idea of being more systematic and longer range and thinking about sort of how we think about our needs and our programming and what we're going to maintain regardless. So I've been thinking about that a lot recently as well, and thinking about how do we be more clear about what our objectives are long term. How does the financial picture fit within that? How do we maintain that over time, given the pressures that we've talked about this year in particular? But just want to mention those couple of things to share a little bit and remind us about sort of even as early as February when we were talking about FTE reductions, we didn't know which ones, but in some ways it doesn't matter, because it's going to be stuff that's pretty important when you start talking about 5, 6, 7 staff that are teaching staff. So I just want to have us all keep that in mind as we look at these things.
Thank you, Doug. Bridget?
Sure. So you all know I'm pretty new school committee member. And so I went to statewide training, and they had the statewide budget person come in. And I just wanted to share what she said. She said that the level services budget was the best practice for school committees, and that it was best practice because we have a legal responsibility to balance the educational quality and the fiscal responsibility elements of our position. And because we report directly to the voters, it's important that we're transparent, because when someone shows up next year and teacher X or program Y or thing Z is missing, what happens is we're breaking trust with the community and the sort of voters. And so that's the reasoning behind the level services budget. I have to look into the other types of budgeting to even know the pros and cons of those at that sort, but I just wanted to share that with you because that was new information for me of how they do it and the reasoning for why they do it. And then the second thing I wanted to say is we're overdue for our school improvement plans, but in our new super mentioned in her interview that if she was looking at budget cuts, that her approach would be to look at the school improvement plans, align the educational data in the schools to see what programs we have are being most successful, which are not, and how are those aligning with our educational goals that we have there in the school improvement plans. So it would be really sort of a building by building process of looking at where are there some efficiencies, where do we need to make the case for more spending, et cetera, to do well and reach those goals under the school improvement plans. And it looks like Doug probably has something to say about those. He's leaning forward.
Okay. Any other comments? I think our time is up. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
I'll second.
Okay, thanks. All right, motion to adjourn is on the floor. I'm an aye. Bernie,
Yes.
Mandy, Councilor Haneke,
Aye.
Andy,
Aye.
Alicia,
Yes.
Matt.
Support.
I think that's everyone. All right, it's unanimous. Oh, Kathy, sorry.
Yeah.
All right, that's everyone. Everyone, thank you very much, and we'll meet again on Friday. Also, what we're going to do on Friday is review what we have of the report. So if you can get your sections to me, that would be great. I recognize that, Alicia, for example, your stuff is going to be on the agenda for Friday, so you obviously can't write anything up, but we do need to try to get this going as fast as we can. So again, thank you very much, everyone, and we will see you on Friday.
Thank you.